June 3rd, 2020. Man, the world is falling apart, and it is up to us as individuals to not fall apart, to stay strong and stay united as one, regardless of circumstance, race, everything. We have to stand together as citizens against this oppression and acknowledge that we do have huge differences in our experience, and that everyone's experience is important and valid and counts. So I want to share a wonderful article that I found about these riots and protests and the differences here. You have to ask yourself a really, really, really important question, because while your heart is fighting for something that you believe, are your actions that you are taking being received as that of a advocate or that of an agitator? And while your heart may in the place of advocating for something that you have great passion for, is your delivery that of an aggressive agitator? And that's hard to change or to acknowledge and then adjust. And I've been on both sides in different scenarios. And I'm not talking about this current event that is this racial injustice that is happening. This has been awful. But if you don't think the same oppressors that have created this manufactured pandemic to create martial law amongst us all aren't leveraging this and controlling where it goes, think again, because they are. And they are instigating the violence and the chaos to keep us, number one, divided, and number two, distracted. And we are easily controlled. For a little bit of perspective, and that is the key to solving all of this: perspective. You gotta pay attention and listen to one another. Listen. But if we're the ones talking, or if you are the one talking, you have to understand that all you can do is share your message. You can't force somebody. You can't force somebody your perspective. Okay? Everyone's experience is different. And if you have experienced things in your recent life that have given you an eye-opening perspective to a world you didn't know existed before, you want to force this amazing perspective that you have on everybody you know, because they should know what you now know. Or even if you've lived this perspective for your whole life and you know nobody else understands, and this may be an opportunity for you to open their eyes, you want to force it on them. You can't. You cannot force your experience and your perspective on everyone else. Believe me, I've tried, and it doesn't work. The best you can do is share what you know and then live by example. Be accepting of everyone. Be the loving person. Be the one that is what you want everybody else to be. That's the best you can do. So there's a few videos I want to point you to. Today, Ben Swan uploaded a fantastic video, and you can tell he is very passionate and frustrated. Look at his face. He is so frustrated with current events and the way society is playing into the hands of the puppet masters controlling us right now, literally sitting back and watching us kill one another. It's entertainment to them. So first of all, I highly recommend you go to Ben Swan's YouTube and watch today's upload of who is placing piles of bricks at the protests. And this is clear. This has been happening. This has been all over social media. It's absolutely clear that these riots are being instigated on purpose to create chaos and distract from the underlying honorable message of the actual protests. The riots are taking away from the very important and honorable message of the protests. So I'm just going to read quickly a little excerpt of what he says. Ben Swan says at the beginning of this video, he says, these agitators, these agent provocateurs are not your friends. Speaking of the rioters. They are not helping further the cause of Black Lives Matter. They are not helping to spread the word of the protesters. They are in fact sowing chaos in a way that ultimately robs the protesters of their voice. The voice of legitimate protesters, calling for legitimate changes in society, calling for legitimate alterations to our criminal justice system, and demanding accountability for and from police officers and demanding tactic changes. These rioters are robbing the protesters of these important messages, right? What these protests are fighting for is, one, justice for the horrible injustice that has happened and people have gotten away with, officers have gotten away with for decades and even centuries, unjust, with legal liability to get away with it. And the demand for change is important and needs to happen now. We all need to be held accountable as citizens, regardless of what authority we carry. The protests, I stand behind 100%. All of the protests. Unfortunately, the riots and the looting tend to come along with it. But man, it was bound to happen, okay? We're angry. We're being controlled. Our rights are being taken away. We've been locked up in our homes. And everyone's got a short fuse. And then something like this happens again and again and again. There's only a handful of these get caught on video or on social media. This happens all the time. This isn't anything new. That's what's horrible. So what's happening with the protests is very important and very justified. So I highly recommend this. It's a 9-minute video from Ben Swan. 1 second. I got a seizure. Pause. Okay. Sorry about that. I had to run upstairs and help with a seizure. Honestly, I don't even remember where I was. So I'd like you to, if you would, watch that video from Ben Swan. And if you would, continue with the medical martial law playlist on the Fear versus Freedom channel, because these are connected. Not the unjust activity of law enforcement. I mean, to a degree, it's all connected. It really is. When your eyes are open, you see that this is all connected. And the oppression is everywhere. And of course, we all have it to a different degree. I'm not saying that I've experienced anything near. But to my point, I've had experience being both an advocate and an agitator. And I try to advocate very heavily for two obvious main topics. One, medical marijuana, for everybody to have the legal right to have access to whatever substance they want to treat their bodies with. It's their body. And two, to help people recognize the danger of vaccines, that they're unnecessary, and that they should never, ever be mandatory. Okay? And I've handled these very two different ways. With medical marijuana, very much so, I've been a good advocate, okay, where I've been, part of ballot initiatives and going out and knocking doors and educating people that had very strong opinions against mine, and having open conversations and sharing my experience and sharing facts and data and reality, and helping open their eyes and getting them to think, wow, maybe I'm missing something here and I need to start doing some of my own research and open my eyes a bit and expand perspective, right? And then I've been the agitator. And when it comes to vaccines, it's very hard not to push into and cross over into that agitator, right? Because people don't want to hear it. They have belief in mind. And this is something that those angry enough to riot and loot and be, violent, seek revenge, justice from violence, with violence, because they're so passionate and hurt and angry. And that perspective, their perspective, which is so valid and so important, you have to see what I know. You have to experience what I experience. And I get it. And I've pushed that hard on people, and I've violated relationships and pushed people away because, and it's the people you love the most. And I know something. My perspective has changed because I've seen something and it's important and real, and I need you to know it. I need you to see it. I need you to know it. But I can't force it. And that's why I've gone to YouTube, to stop pushing my perspective on my family members, on my friends, on the people that I love. I still do it to a degree, but I've pulled back a bit and just said, you know what? I'm going to put my message where anyone can see it, and if they want to see it, or not even if they want, when they're ready to accept something contradictory to their beliefs, it's there. Okay? I can't force it, and you can't force it. It doesn't work that way. We have to be open. We have to be ready. You and I, we get to lead by example and say, here's how I live. Here's how I do it. And when it comes to being inclusive, be that. Embrace everybody. Love everybody. Support everybody. Don't point fingers and say, you don't see what I see, so you suck. Or you're not a good person because you don't act the way I act because I've learned things that you don't know. That's not how to handle it, right? Be the loving, inclusive, and supporting person that you want everybody else to be. Be that leader. And people will follow. Not everyone. And we don't have to save everyone as much as we want to. I want everybody to understand what I understand, but people don't. And some people just don't care. They don't give a shit, and that will never change. But you don't have to attack them for not caring the way you care. And I don't have to attack people for not caring the way I care. I can just say, please, 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 try to see things from my perspective so that you can make better decisions. Or when you make the same decisions that you're making, you know better the consequences of them, right? Anyway, this would go on forever. I do want to share an article that I think was written really well. And it's called, this came out on May 30th. So was that 4 days ago? The Psychology of Rioting, the Language of the Unheard. Okay. To understand the psychology of protests fragmenting into riots, we should first go back and watch or read Martin Luther King's 1967 speech, The Other America. The most relevant passage in this one. Quote, "Let me say, as I've always said, and I will always continue to say, that riots are socially destructive and self-defeating. I'm still convinced that nonviolence is the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom and justice. I feel that violence will only create more social problems than they will solve. That in real sense it is impracticable for the Negro to even think of mounting a violent revolution in the United States. So I will continue to condemn riots and continue to say to my brothers and sisters that this is not the way, and continue to affirm that there is another way. But at that same time," and this is important, guys, "but at that same time, it is as necessary for me to be as vigorous in condemning the conditions which cause persons to feel that they must engage in riotous activities as it is for me to condemn the riots." The message can't be lost, folks. I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And that is still the case today in today's society. And so, in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And delay we do. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. And again, and again, and again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. So we can denounce rioting all day long and the looting and acknowledge that it's taking away from the important message of the protesters, but social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. So until we get to this point of social justice and progress, it's not going to end, guys. Whether Trump brings in the military. Dr. King's speech pretty much says it all. He reminds us that if we were to condemn rioting for the destructive, unbridled, and opportunistic aggression that it is, or more importantly, to try to prevent it from happening in the first place, we first have to understand its cause. Rioting can be thought of as a symptom of a disease. And this is a really, really great analogy. Rioting can be thought of as a symptom of a disease. Now, in order to treat the symptom, we have to treat the disease or the root cause, right? The disease or the root cause in this case is systemic racism. Systemic. Society is programmed this way and has been for decades. And yes, we've made baby steps of progression, but it is still a systemic problem, especially within authority organizations. In this case, systemic racism that persists more than 50 years after Dr. King's speech and his later assassination. It's been just under a week since the death of George Floyd. It's been 2 months since the death of Breonna Taylor, 3 months since the death of Ahmaud Arbery, 2 years since the death of Stephen Clark, 4 years since the death of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, 5 years since the death of Freddie Gray and Sandra Bland, 6 years since the death of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and Tamir Rice, 8 years since the death of Rakita Boyd and Trayvon Martin, 13 lives lost, but none held accountable. And that's just the short list. And it really is. This is happening all the time. In 2016, San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick started taking a knee during the national anthem before games at the suggestion of Army veteran Nate Boyer. He was soon blackballed from the NFL based on the perverted claim that his act of nonviolent genuflection was somehow an insult to American servicemen. It should come as little surprise then, as Dr. King presaged, that people who feel unheard and outraged after seeing a knee being used in a violent act of aggression by an oppressor rather than as a part of a peaceful protest by the oppressed also feel as if they have no other recourse than to lash out. And that is really hard. It's a really hard pill for people to swallow because we have our beliefs, and beliefs are very hard to challenge. And everybody has a very strong belief about what happened here in this situation, just as current events are tearing families apart because of personal perspective and opinion. This did too. This did too. And while some people saw an oppressed people taking a nonviolent protest, others saw an act of aggression. Again, it's perspective, it's belief. We have to learn how to expand our views. And we didn't chime in a lot on any of this other than to support those that were fighting for one side and completely outnumbered. And we said, look, perspective is important. Hashtag perspective. We hear you. And that's what people need. They need to know they're heard and supported. But they can't lash out and force their perspective on you. It doesn't work. Understanding the psychological roots of rioting is not the same as saying that it is justified or should be condoned, and it's not. It isn't, and it shouldn't be. But trying to address the symptoms of a disease without addressing its root cause is bad medicine. And that's medicine in general. It's always just treating the symptom and never the root cause. And that is what happens when we are trying to focus on the rioting and the looting without focusing on the systemic racism that is leading to this. Okay? If we don't address underlying systemic racism, acts of racially motivated violence, and policing contaminated by implicit bias, violence will continue to respond with violence, unfortunately. As we react and comment on the public response to the murder of George Floyd, we should take care to avoid lumping rioting and rioters and looters together with protests and protesters, as if they are necessarily the same thing or the same people, because they are not. Although it has been argued that nonviolent protesting, rioting, and even looting are points on a continuum of political revolt, often aimless violence and looting represents the opportunistic exploitation of chaos and lawlessness. And that's important to understand. New information from around the country suggests that some of the most unruly behavior might be perpetrated by those with their own agendas distinct from the protesters, which is obvious. This is obvious that's what's happening. And what's sad is somebody can denounce these protests while still defending the voice of the denounce the riots while still supporting the protesters, but be attacked for denouncing the riots, even though they're still acknowledging that the voice of the protester needs to be heard. And that's wrong. But regardless of the perpetrators, the violence and the destruction are ultimately counterproductive and often harm the very communities that need healing. And this is exactly what's happening. This violence is taking away from the support, the voices, the healing, and the underlying systemic issue that needs to be heard. Still, like a secondary opportunistic infection, such behavioral extremes arise from the same underlying systemic disease. So that denouncing the riots without denouncing its root causes is just as counterproductive. And that is true, but that's not what most people are doing. Most people that are denouncing the riots are acknowledging the root cause and saying, what started this is wrong. Where it went is also wrong. The protesters are not the ones rioting. Those are opportunistic people with their own agenda. As Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote during the 2015 Baltimore riots sparked by the death of Freddie Gray, when nonviolence is preached as an attempt to evade the repercussion of political brutality, it betrays itself. When nonviolence begins halfway through the war with the aggressor calling a timeout, it exposes itself as a ruse. When nonviolence is preached by the representatives of the state, while the state doles out heaps of violence to its citizens, it reveals itself to be a con. And none of this can mean that rioting or violence is correct or wise any more than a forest fire can be correct or wise. Wisdom isn't the point tonight. Disrespect is. In this case, disrespect for the hollow law and failed order that so regularly disrespects the community. Man. Unfortunately, as King's memory and Coates' words remind us all too well, what's sorely missing from the protests across the country right now is organization, focus, and leadership. That's not true in all causes. A lot of these protests are organized and led, but there are separate groups, opportunistic groups creating the riots and taking away from their message. So I don't necessarily agree with that point, because I do think the protesters know what they're doing and are trying to do it right. And their message is being drowned. The mass protests that occurred during the Occupy Wall Street movement were similarly unfocused and agendaless, and in the end did little to combat income equality. If we are ever to transform our outrage into meaningful social change, we have to do more than take to the streets with cell phones. We have to organize rallies, not riots. We have to use the pen and our voices before the sword and the stone. And we need leaders who rise from the flames of civil unrest to navigate us arm in arm. Well, that's kind of hard when we're told we can't be 6 feet near each other. But anyway. To navigate us arm in arm, both literally and figuratively, away from purposeless violence toward purposeful progress in civil rights and social justice that began more than a half century ago. This began centuries ago. This has been going on forever. And the message of the protest is so important. The underlying cause, the systemic racism, and the liability that's given. It will never change until we're all held to the same standards, not just law enforcement and citizens, but the elite class and the middle and lower class. We all need to be held to the same standards. We're not. So anyway, I thought that was a pretty good article. I understand the importance of perspective, and that my perspective is not your perspective, and your perspective is not my perspective. But you can share it, and that's about all you can do. You can't force it on me. You can't force it on your family. Yes, your eyes may have been opened wide during changes in life and experiences in life, and you want people to know what you now know, but you can't force it on them. You lead by example. You now understand that comments made within your family and even by yourself were wrong, and that you didn't even recognize bias within yourself until these changes happened, and now you do, and now you see it all over, and you want people to see what you see. Live by example. Be the accepting, embracing, loving, and supporting person that you want everyone else to be, and stop attacking and pointing fingers and saying you're a horrible person because you're not me. I want people to know what I know, what I've experienced. And I've tried to force it on people. It doesn't work. And you're only breaking what you're trying to fix. Lead by example. We all need to, arm in arm, be accepting, be loving, smile at everyone. Offer a helping hand. Embrace. I don't know what else to say. There are horrible injustices in this world, and it goes far beyond police brutality amongst race indifference. Way beyond. And when your eyes are open, you see it everywhere. It goes beyond race. We're all oppressed and hurt, and yes, many different degrees. And I'm not saying I'm anywhere near what other races go through, but I see it, and I embrace, and I love, and I support, and I listen. and I hear you, and I see you. I'm proud of you, and I push as much as I can without hurting. At least I try. And that's really all you can do is love and accept and share. Don't point fingers and don't attack. Lead by example. Be the change that you want to see. And people will follow. People will follow. That's it. Love you guys.